That epic gamer moment when you have to have a filler video because everything else you make is like 40 minutes long and it takes too fucking long.
Listen. I love Pokemon, you guys know that. It's like my favorite thing in general. I made a whole video about it. I love Pokemon to death, but I would be a fool and a fanboy to dismiss some of the absolute bullshit this series pulls. As much as I love and enjoy Pokemon, there's a ton of things I hate about it, so today, let's talk about it. Let's get weird, let's get wild, and let's get right in to some things that I hate about Pokemon. From a fan's perspective, so don't get the wrong idea, you fucking assholes. This video is going to be split into two sections, one for the anime and one for the games. Let's start with the anime. What's the deal with TPCI retroactively renaming the anime? And better yet, why can nobody in the community seem to agree on a universal naming convention for the anime arcs? Let's start by going over the right way to refer to the anime. The way they do it in Japan is that each generation has its own subtitle. Kanto, Johto, and the Orange Islands are considered the original series, or OS for short, since they're just called Pokemon or Pocket Monsters with no subtitle. Hoenn and the Kanto Battle Frontier arcs make up Pokemon Advanced Generation, or AG for short, and every generation after that is named after the games they coincide with, like DP for Diamond and Pearl, BW for Black and White or Best Wishes in Japan, XY for X and Y, and SM for Sun and Moon. The only exceptions to this naming convention are XYZ, which most people just lump in with XY for convenience sake anyways, since it's not a different series, and the other exception is the current series, which some people refer to as SS for Sword and Shield, or PM for Pocket Monsters, since this series doesn't have a subtitle just like original series did. Personally, I would call it PM since elements from Sword and Shield aren't that heavily featured, but I guess the current series is still under debate. Regardless, this is the correct way to refer to the anime. These aren't seasons or sagas like a lot of people like to refer to them as. That's a localization thing. These are series. Keep this in mind, since the way they localize the anime has a terrible naming convention, and is what I think confused people into thinking there are seasons to the anime, or that these arcs are considered seasons, because they're not. In English, or at least here in the States, each series is divided up into seasons, all with different names. Original series is split into 5 seasons in English, with Indigo League, Adventures in the Orange Islands, The Johto Journeys, Johto League Champions, and Master Quest. Advanced Generation is split into 4 seasons, with Advanced, Advanced Challenge, Advanced Battle, and Battle Frontier. Diamond and Pearl is split into 4 seasons as well, with Diamond and Pearl Battle Dimension, Diamond and Pearl Galactic Battles, Diamond and Pearl Sinnoh League Victors, all of which have Diamond and Pearl fully in the title, and it's kind of a pain in the ass. Black and White is divided into 3 seasons, with Black and White Rival Destinies, and Black and White Adventures in Unova and Beyond, which again, they use the entire title of Black and White in the full thing. It's a mouthful. X and Y is also divided into 3 seasons, with those being XY, XY Kalos Quest, and XY and Z. And Sun and Moon is also split into 3 seasons, with Sun and Moon Ultra Adventures, and Sun and Moon Ultra Legends. And as I'm writing this video, the current series hasn't been localized yet, so we'll have to wait on that. Not only does splitting each series into seasons like this make absolutely no sense, it also gives off the illusion that there are more arcs than there actually are. Even worse, these seasons don't even have any structure to them to be calling them seasons. Though to be fair, these do a lot of animated shows, so But if you thought these titles were confusing, now TPCI is going back and retroactively renaming the anime. They keep the same subtitles, but now they're calling it Pokemon the series instead of just Pokemon. We didn't need this. Just name it the way Japan names it. That naming convention is more accurate and it's much simpler. Now we have a million different naming conventions that a million different people use, and you can barely ever tell what somebody else is talking about. Another thing that bugs me about the anime is in regards to the current series. I don't have much to say about it. I think it's fine, it works. I like the characters and how their motivations are explained, and it's a much more casual approach to storytelling and new Pokemon. It's not as upfront or in your face about it like, hey! New Pokemon! As the other series were at times. But if it's one thing that drives me off the fucking wall about this series, it's the way it handles continuity. Contrary to what some of you might believe for some reason, Pocket Monsters 2019 is not a reboot. The continuity is there, and we see this reference from the very first episode of this series where we see Ash's badges and trophies from his previous adventures, or later in the series how the temporary gym leader from the Vermilion City Gym recognizes Ash as the guy who beat Lieutenant Surge all the way back in original series. We also recently received word that trainers from older series are coming back, namely Karina, whom Ash is probably going to battle in the Pokemon World Championships. I love neat little tidbits like this, where Ash's previous journeys are referenced and in some cases relevant to the narrative. My problem with this series is that they don't do it enough. Almost every episode of this series has some kind of opportunity to reference past events or for Ash to call in his other Pokemon, but they never do it. For example, the 3rd episode is all about the Bulbasaur line, yet at no point does Ash even mention his trusty old Bulbasaur, or the other Kanto starters in the episode before it. Another example is episode 7, where Ash challenges part of the Hoenn Battle Frontier. Instead of calling in an old Pokemon for this, he decides to use his mom's Mr. Mime, which I guess was kind of funny, but it would have been so much cooler to see an old favorite in the situation, which would have worked just fine since Ash hadn't caught any new Pokemon at that point. To be fair, I do like his new captures like Dragonite, Gengar, and Riolu, and it's looking like he might get Sobble or something else in the near future. And like I explained in one of my Defending Ash Ketchum videos, I understand why they aren't very liberal with their bringing back of old Pokemon, but this series is the perfect time to do it with how casual it is. Ash is in the Pokemon World Championships, so it would make sense for him to use Pokemon that he's met from all over the world. They just don't do it, and it really bothers me. Either way, it looks as though they might be trying to incorporate more continuity and references to this series, but if they're gonna do that, all I ask is that they be consistent with it. Either go all in with it, or don't go in at all. And the final thing that I hate about the anime right now is the dub. Now, I'm not a dub versus sub guy by any means. In fact, I've watched just as much dubbed anime as I have sub. But Pokemon's dub is not good, and it hasn't been for quite some time. Don't get it twisted though, the dub was pretty great until X and Y, but it was X and Y that marked a change for the dub that didn't really work for it at all. The voice actors were all fine, and I think Serenata Chenny specifically has really grown into the role of Ash during her time as the character. By the way, can we please stop calling her the new voice of Ash? Because she's been voicing him for like 13 years, alright? She's earned the respect at this point. Anyways, back to the dub. For whatever reason, in 2013, TPCI must have lost the rights to the Shinji Miyazaki score for Pokemon that they've been using internationally for about 17 years at that point. So with the dub of X and Y, they replaced the Japanese background music with original compositions, and while not always bad, it doesn't do it for me. My main problem with the dub score is that every song sounds the same and it rarely fits the situation at hand. Like, we'll be in like a really hardcore battle or something, but the music will be this like fluttery, chipper tune that doesn't match the tone that the scene originally had. What's even weirder is that sometimes the original Miyazaki score is used, but sometimes it isn't. So I'm really not sure why they're allowed to use some tracks but not others. Like the Swords of Justice theme and the movie jingles were used all the time in the sub when Miyazaki was still working on it, but the dub removes them completely. Sometimes they even just straight up remake the Miyazaki score, like the XY battle theme for instance. The song has the exact same melody, both dubbed and subbed, but when you go back and listen to them back to back, they're clearly two different tracks. Occasionally, they add background music to scenes that didn't originally have any, and it usually kills those scenes dead. I'm not sure why they do this, you'd think it'd be a licensing problem, but TPCI handles its own dub, so why can't they afford or have the rights to their own music? They've demonstrated that they are capable of getting access to the original score like they did with Movie 21, so I don't see why they can't do that with the series itself. I doubt it's a financial thing either, since almost every current anime dub these days has the original music, and that doesn't seem to be a problem for them. It's probably more complicated than we think it is, and I assume they probably have a good reason to be replacing the score, but the new tracks just don't match the scenes they're in half the time. This is why I haven't watched the dub in years, and I'll be sticking to the subs until either the music gets better, or until they can get the original score. Maybe once the new series gets localized, they'll be able to get the rights to the original score, but I'm not holding my breath. Now let's move on to some of my pet peeves regarding the Pokemon games, specifically about Sword and Shield since they're current and they're kind of topical. If you guys remember a while back, I made my big Internet Idiocracy episode on the whole Pokemon Sword and Shield controversy, and I think a lot of people missed the point of that video. The point was not to defend Sword and Shield, because that would be dumb. They aren't good games. The point was to explain why they came out as bad games, not to excuse that fact. Of course, this was also among other things like debunking these supposed lies told by Game Freak that weren't actually lies, but I digress. I play Sword and Shield on a weekly basis over on Twitch, and I bought the game day one, and as somebody who has played it a lot, it's really not a good game. I know a lot of people say, oh, you know, it's flawed, but I forgive the flaws. But I am not one of those people. The only reason I still play the game is because it's the current one that everyone else is playing. So even though I think the game is bad and I think some of its flaws are completely unforgivable, I'm kinda stuck with it. In fact, I should probably rephrase my earlier statement. It's not that the game is necessarily bad, because at its core, it's still Pokemon and it still has that Pokemon charm to it. It's that the game feels incomplete. And I'm not saying that because of the graphical problems or the NatDex thing, because I don't care about those. I'm saying that because there is literally nothing to do after you've beaten the game, aside from online battles, which get old pretty quick. Especially if you've been using the same team for 3 months like I have, because I'm too lazy to actually breed and trade a new one. But I digress again. This has been a problem that Pokemon has been facing since X and Y, where the post-game has so little that it might as well not even be there. I've said it before on this channel, and I will say it again, but Black 2 and White 2 were the last Pokemon games that felt truly complete. There was so fucking much to do in that game that I picked it up after not touching it for like 3 years, and there were still things for me to do that weren't online battles. X and Y had the Battle Maison and like, 2 legendary encounters, and that's about it. Sun and Moon were slight improvements in that regard, but Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon improved upon this by adding the Rainbow Rocket stuff and the Ultra Space sections, the Mantine surfing, and a few other odds and ends that gave it some semblance of a post-game. In its base state, Sword and Shield does not have that. After you beat the game, there's an epilogue where you catch your box legendary, and then it just kinda ends. Now you can complete your deck, shiny hunt, breed, and battle, but those were a given in every generation, and I don't think those things qualify as post-game content. I don't mind the endless battle towers, but even those get old because I feel like the greatest challenge you can get is by battling another skilled player. And that gets old as well because building a new team is still a pain in the ass in this game despite all the little quality of life changes, though this isn't really an issue for you filthy fucking hackers out there. Hopefully the DLC will alleviate this issue by adding some fun replayable challenges, but if you're gonna do DLC, make sure your base game will keep people playing until that DLC comes out, because I can only assume that Swish's player base is dropping by the week. And speaking of Swish, the online functionality is absolute dog shit garbage in this game. The only way you can actually trade with friends or get specific Pokemon is by using the GTS in Pokemon Home, but not everybody has that. And even if you're like me and have no integrity and you bought it anyways, the GTS is still as unusable as it was back in Gen 4, with people asking for legendaries in exchange for the most common of Pokemon. Like, check this out, right? I go to search for a Litten because I need a hidden ability Litten for a team I've been working on, because, you know, Intimidate and Incineroar is all the rage in the meta these days. And if I go to look for one, even if I turn the legendary filter off, I still get people asking for Poipoles or unobtainable Pokemon like level 1 to 10 Salamences or some shit. It's absolute garbage. If I want to get a specific Pokemon, I am much better off asking for it on r/Pokemon trades or something. And battling is a whole other story. How are we 8 generations in, and there is still no concrete way to get a 6v6 battle with randoms? I know the Smogon tiers aren't official or anything, but at least allow the users to make specific rooms for certain tiers or something so we can battle in-game. You know, like maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 for OU, 1, 2, 3, 3 for UU. You know what I mean. We as the community have the tools to sidestep these issues, but these are issues that shouldn't be there in the first place. I shouldn't have to go to a subreddit or a Discord server to find a trade or a battle. I know almost every Pokemon fan says this, but the PSS back in Gen 6 was great for stuff like this. It wasn't perfect, but it was usable. Pokemon's online has always ebbed and flowed with each generation, and Sword and Shields isn't the worst that we've seen. You know, the interface is nice and simple and the most basic of options are there, but it's still not very good. Another thing that pisses me off is Dynamaxing, this generation's new battle mechanic that has drastically changed up the metagame. A lot of people absolutely despise Dynamaxing because it's just, they'll make Pokemon big. But I actually see why they did it the way that they did it. The purpose of the older mechanics like Megas and Z-moves were to give weaker Pokemon a power boost so they can contend with the bigger threats of the meta. Megas did this by adding temporary form and stat changes, but they only applied to a select few Pokemon. Z-moves were an attempt to do this very same thing, but on a larger scale, where instead of only a few Pokemon getting a power boost, now every Pokemon can get one in a way that doesn't give them all an alternate form, instead just a really strong generic move based on typing. People love to glorify these mechanics as if they were inherently better than what we have today, when that's not necessarily the case. Megas became super unbalanced because they ended up making Pokemon that were already strong even stronger, and Z-moves didn't make the impact on the meta that Game Freak was probably hoping for, since they were more or less useless. So when I see how Dynamaxing works, I can see why they did it the way that they did it, and why it more or less replaced these older mechanics. Dynamaxing is what I view as Pokemon's attempt at combining Megas and Z-moves into one all-encompassing mechanic. It only increases the HP stat for 3 turns, but that can be more than enough to get some frailer Pokemon to tank a hit, depending on the circumstances of course. Some Pokemon get form changes when they Dynamax, so it's keeping that kind of vibe from Megas. And Max moves are very clearly a spiritual successor to Z-move, this time with added caveats like stat changes, weather, and terrains. I see exactly what they were going for. They were going for a mechanic that could be visually interesting with form changes and stat increases and powerful moves that could change the tide of the battle. The problem with this mechanic, it's too convoluted. What I mean by this is that when you Dynamax in battle and get a few moves off, all these added effects stack pretty quick, and it gets hard to keep track of. Depending on the situation, you can have weather, a terrain, some stat increases for yourself or drops from your opponent, and on top of that you could have stuff like Trick Room or the other effects of some of the other G-Max exclusive moves. That's a lot to keep track of, especially if you aren't planning like 5 steps ahead. Like let's say I used Max Lightning to take out a Pelipper or something, and I gotta heal up my Snorlax with Rest this turn. I've just screwed myself by setting up the electric terrain so now my Snorlax can't fall asleep and he can't heal, and I accidentally just gave my opponent's Jolteon a speed boost. Obviously this scenario wouldn't happen if you're skilled enough to play around it, but something like this could happen, all because there's just so much going on that it's hard to keep track of all these secondary effects. We didn't have this kind of thing with Megas, and though I hate to contribute to their excessive glorification, they were the right way to go about slowing down power creep. I mentioned earlier that Megas were unbalanced, and many of them certainly were. Some of them were completely broken, but they were the right kind of broken. By limiting the number of Pokemon that could Mega Evolve, it made things a lot easier to counter the broken ones, since you know what the biggest threats are, you know what the most powerful Megas are, and since a lot of these external field effects weren't as common back then, battles were a lot more direct, since Mega Evolution itself was much more straightforward. With Megas, we were able to find balance in the chaos, if that makes sense. Now with Dynamaxing, we have all these side effects that you get from using it that can work against you if you're not absolutely meticulous about how you use it. That may be a positive to some, but for those of us who are a little more casually competitive, it can be seen as a detriment. It feels like all the chaos of Megas, but without any of the order. Of course, there are pros to Dynamaxing over Megas and vice versa, but I think it ultimately comes down to which is cooler and which came first. Personally, I think Mega Evolution is like the coolest shit Pokemon has ever added just from a fan service perspective, and I'm not going to tell you that it's inherently better than Dynamaxing or that Dynamaxing doesn't have its pros or its place in the game, but it just feels like a step down. Dynamaxing feels like something they did to take advantage of the hardware, not necessarily to better the game, which is why I think the feature ended up the way that it did. I'm not one of those people who thinks that every feature from every game needs to carry over to each subsequent game, since that creates feature bloat, but Dynamaxing just makes me want Mega Evolution back, and I've got a glimmer of hope that it'll return in some capacity. Megas were in Let's Go and the recent Mystery Dungeon remakes, so Game Freak certainly still wants to use them in some capacity. It's possible that they just didn't add them into Sword and Shield so they wouldn't conflict with Dynamaxing from a balancing perspective, and if that's the case, then I can certainly understand why they weren't included, but now we're just getting into speculation. So I guess for the TLDR for this section, Dynamaxing is too complicated and it creates too much chaos in the battlefield for things to be fun. And since we're talking about giant Pokemon, Jesus H. Christ, raid battles suck so much ass. Don't get me wrong, I love the concept of raid battles, and they are a great way for beginners to get a hold of Pokemon with good IVs and hidden abilities, but they are so unbelievably tedious. I already complained about the online functionality, but it is put to the test with raid battles. If you try to join a raid, there's like a 50% chance it's already started, so you can't get in, and if you try to host a raid, it's a complete gamble if anyone actually joins. It is a long 3 minutes waiting for somebody to join, and it is never a guarantee. I've found in my experience that the raids for more popular Pokemon are easy to get other players to join, but even then, sometimes you're on your own. These games should have been designed so that players who don't have a Nintendo Switch Online subscription can still play the game to the fullest, but completing 5-star raids is borderline impossible on your own, since the NPCs suck and the shields sometimes waste your Dynamax turns. I've tried several 5-star raids on my own using IV bred and EV trained Pokemon, but it doesn't matter how strong you are, the raid bosses are always stronger if you don't have other players to back you up. Pokemon has always tried to future-proof itself in this regard, where the old games still work perfectly and will continue to do so even once the servers go down. There's maybe like 1 or 2 features that you would no longer have access to without online functionality in the old games. For example, the DS entries are still 99% functional without the DS's servers. The only things you can't do are use the GTS and battle long distance, though there are workarounds for those with fan-made servers. But what happens to Sword and Shield in like 10, maybe 20 years when the Nintendo Switch servers inevitably go down? Raid battles, one of the main mechanics in the game, become pointless, since the only raids you'd be able to win are the 1 or 2 star ones, which are essentially no better than any other wild Pokemon. Most Gigantamax Pokemon are only obtainable through raid battles, and most of those are 4 or 5 stars. And like we've already established, those are super hard to beat on your own with just the NPCs. I suppose it would add an artificial challenge, but with the way Sword and Shield is anyways, I don't foresee many people playing them 1 or 2 gens in the future. I'm calling it right now, Sword and Shield are going to age poorly, unless the DLC can add something to make it worth a revisit in the future. People are still going back and revisiting the likes of Gens 4, 5, 7, and even Let's Go, because those games had unique things about them that make them worth returning to, and I'm afraid Sword and Shield doesn't have that, at least not yet. However, that's going to be enough of me ranting and complaining for today, but don't get the wrong idea from this video. I say these things because I love Pokemon and I want to see it improve, so to see it do a ton of things badly is disappointing to say the least. I criticize, but I do it out of love for the series. But that's going to be all for this video. Let me know what you guys think down below. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and consider subscribing for more videos like this one. I've been MattCMG. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.